There's a lot of talk about, there's a lot of talk about the sovereign movement and individual sovereignty and how people are living as men and women on the land and in that jurisdiction rather than the Admiralty Maritime jurisdiction as a corporate entity, and how people are escaping that dynamic and establishing themselves so that they can operate privately in their individual capacity as a child of the Most High and, you know, entitled to the provisions of the Most High, which as a corporate entity under statutory Admiralty jurisdiction, they're not entitled to, because that U.S. citizen, that paper entity that was created at birth, is not a child of God. It is not entitled to the provision of the kingdom of heaven, but the living men and women are. So now that we've made that distinction and we are learning about all this kind of stuff, and I'm talking a little bit about history and how these things were established and where it came from and why it's there, so that we can recognize patterns and we can ask better questions. A little bit of the history of this, actually more of an overview and the purpose of studying the history of where these things came from and the manumission processes, the freedom papers where the slaves would buy their family out of slavery, and you know, all these things that were the beginnings of the stock market, because they had certificates of security interest that they would trade in. And I can go into all that, but Ty is way better at it. And also he knows a lot about it because he actually went to the halls of the congressional libraries and read the true historical accounts and the historical records that taught about these things. And that's one reason he's such a good teacher on it, because he knows the ins and outs of it and he knows the history. And so the point that I'm trying to make with this video is this: if we ask better questions, we may not come up with precise answers, but somewhere along our path we will encounter the truth. Or we will come up with questions that will lead us to the truth. And that's really the goal, is to ask better questions so we can move further down the line. You know, whether we actually find out the historical accurate, what actually happened, who knows? I haven't gotten there yet. Hopefully I never stop asking questions, because as my questions evolve, the information that I encounter evolves, and the universe just provides me with more questions. So, but it's you know, that's the joy of being a lifelong learner. Is, you know, first you have to learn how to ask questions and how to, you know, critically analyze the data that you're given and spot patterns and that sort of thing. So one thing that I've said repeatedly, and I've heard it repeatedly among the groups that I study with, is that if you try to study the history of religion without studying the history of law, or I'm sorry, let me start over again. If you try to study law without studying the history of religion, you can't do it. You can't study law that really, you know, I'm not talking about statutory law like what the lawyers study. I'm talking about the common law and the law that applies to men and women. The real true law is based on biblical principles. It actually is laid out in several places in the Bible, or some portions of it are, and it can all be correlated to the Bible. And so, you know, that's why they call the law, the book, the Bible is the law. The law is in there. And it's meant to be a guidebook. For instance, the Proverbs read very much like legal maxims. So legal maxims are written in Latin, and so they don't quite translate the same way as the Proverbs, but legal maxims are what judges and lawyers use to kind of guide the principles that they are functioning under. That's what the Proverbs, that's the function that the Proverbs served when they were written. That's what they were for. King Solomon had these Proverbs or legal maxims to provide to the people that he was putting in place to judge over the kingdom, the priests. So they're legal maxims, and we have been construing them as spiritual principles. But, you know, they didn't have statutory law. They only had the law. So back then, you know, everything was kind of, that's the beginning of common law, was the Proverbs. So you can't study law without studying the history of religion. If you try to study religion without studying the history of law, you end up with superstition. And that's what's happened. That's why we take the Bible and we turn it into religious tokens and religious symbols, and we take the spiritual evolution out of it. When you start discovering and asking deep questions, questioning the history, question what it is, question what it means, question why you believe what you believe. Why does the Bible say this, but we do this instead? Ask those questions. And now you're on the path of spiritual growth, progression, maturity, and you don't have to worry about being accepted into a group or not. You can be your weird little self and go sniff daisies all day long if you want to. You're still going to spiritually evolve, and the universe is going to bless you with more knowledge and more questions and more history and more facts and more things, more of a solid foundation that you can lay the path forward and go forward. Keep asking those questions and, you know, serve the purpose of developing as a spiritual being. You don't need religion to do that, okay? The history of religion will teach you that fact there. And you get into the history of religion by studying the law. I don't know if this makes any sense, and maybe I should try to illustrate it or something, but you wind up having a much deeper understanding of the world around you, and it's not an understanding that has been programmed into you. When you understand how the growth of those daisies that you're sniffing is relative to the growth of your children and the growth of your own spiritual development. You can spot patterns and see how those things correlate when you study the law and understand the history of religion. And you can also understand that, you know, the Bible says that, you know, your Father in heaven owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. So why are you begging for bread? That's a good question, is it not? Okay, 7 minutes. Ask questions.